Precisely because of this unique relationship that Morocco has been so relatively stable over the decades, at least compared to its neighbors. Morocco stands out in a continent often beset by political turmoil and instability, having maintained a remarkable degree of peace and relative prosperity since its independence, compared to many of its African neighbors. This stability is not an accident, rather it's due to Morocco maintains stability, even while other countries nearby fall into ruthless dictatorships, bloody civil wars, and general unrest. One of the foundational pillars of Morocco's stability is its long-standing monarchical system. This might sound off because we typically associate peace and prosperity with liberal democracies, but it's true. Unlike many post-colonial African states that experimented with various forms of republican governance, often leading to coups and civil wars, Morocco retained its king, who was very popular when Morocco became independent once again. The Alawi dynasty, with roots stretching back centuries, provided the country with a deep sense of historic continuity and legitimacy. In this way, Morocco is similar to a country like Thailand, or even the United Kingdom. Having a strong, stable figurehead does wonders for ensuring long-lasting peace. The king, particularly King Mohammed VI, plays a central role as a unifying figure, a spiritual leader, and the ultimate arbiter of political power. And while Morocco is not a full democracy, the king has overseen a process of gradual, controlled political reforms, including constitutional amendments and parliamentary elections, which have allowed for some degree of political participation and even dissent, thereby absorbing pressures that might otherwise erupt into wider unrest. This contrasts sharply with countries like Libya and Sudan, which have experienced severe state collapse or prolonged civil conflicts, following the removal or weakening of strong central authorities. Economically, Morocco has also pursued a path of diversification and liberalization, albeit with ongoing challenges. While not a major oil producer like Algeria or Nigeria, Morocco has invested heavily in infrastructure, renewable energy, and export-oriented industries, such as automotive manufacturing, aeronautics, and phosphates. This has created a more resilient economy less vulnerable to the volatile commodity price fluctuations that has destabilized many resource-dependent African countries. Furthermore, the country has actively sought foreign investment and developed strong economic ties with Europe, providing a degree of economic stability and opportunities for its growing population. For example, its robust tourism sector provides a significant source of revenue and employment, a far cry from the economic fragility seen in countries like Somalia or the Central African Republic. Morocco even opened Africa's first ever high-speed rail line, connecting the cities of Tangier and Casablanca, a trip that takes just over 2 hours today. Finally, Morocco's diplomatic strategy has also been crucial. Instead of fighting against and antagonizing the West, it has cultivated strong relationships, particularly with the United States and France, and secured strategic partnerships and economic support. Simultaneously, it has pursued a proactive South-South cooperation policy across Africa. This involves substantial investments in sub-Saharan African countries, often in sectors like banking, telecommunications, and agriculture, alongside initiatives like debt forgiveness and training programs. This engagement fosters goodwill and influence, creating a network of allies and lessening the likelihood of regional destabilization spilling over into Morocco. This stands in stark contrast to Mali, Niger, and Chad, all of which have had military coups in recent years and turned away from Western countries like the United States and France. Of course, no discussion of Morocco's stability can ignore the unresolved issue of Western Sahara. This territory, a former Spanish colony, was annexed by Morocco in 1975, a move not recognized by the United Nations. The Polisario Front, a Sahrawi national movement supported by Algeria, seeks independence for the territory, leading to a long-standing conflict and a frozen dispute. Morocco considers Western Sahara an integral part of its territory and has proposed an autonomy plan under Moroccan sovereignty as a solution. While a UN-brokered ceasefire has largely held since 1991, the conflict continues to be a drain on Moroccan resources and a significant source of regional tension, particularly with Algeria, which has closed its border with Morocco. Despite the ongoing Western Sahara issue, which remains a potential flashpoint, Morocco has managed to contain its direct impact on internal stability. The government maintains firm control over the disputed territory and has invested heavily in its development, aiming to integrate it fully. The conflict, while a geopolitical burden, has not triggered widespread internal unrest, a civil war, or the toppling of the monarch and government, unlike the devastating conflicts seen in countries like Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, or the persistent insurgencies in the Sahel region. As with most countries, Morocco has been so peaceful and successful because it's had a stable government. And more importantly, one that's not only liberalized its economy, but also introduced democratic reforms, while neighboring countries opt to crush the will of its people. This week, my adventures in Europe continue, but instead of a beautiful city, I'm heading to the tiny town that can't decide whether it's part of the Netherlands or Belgium. It's truly one of the craziest borders in the entire world. And if you want to see what it looks like in person, then come join me over on my travel channel. I hope you enjoyed learning all about Morocco. If you did, check out this other video all about why Jordan has also managed to be so successful compared to its neighbors. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
One of the most remote and inhospitable regions on Earth is being engineered into something new. It's happening quietly, methodically, and with purpose. Along the length of the Himalayas, roads are appearing where there were none. Runways are being extended at extreme altitudes. Rivers, once left to flow freely, are being dammed and diverted. When examined case by case, it looks like development, but step back and it's not just the landscape that's being reshaped, it's the balance of power. The sheer scale of these projects dwarfs anything seen outside wartime. The terrain is being reconfigured for movement, reach, and accessibility matters here. The line of actual control, which is the de facto border between India and China, is not fixed by treaties, but by presence. Patrols define territory, and outposts define claims. And so, by building dual-use infrastructure, assets that appear civilian but are strategic in function, Beijing is making its intentions clear. The locations alone say what words don't. Placed just high enough to look down on the rest of South Asia. Tibet is also rich in minerals such as chromium, copper, lithium, borax, and more. But the real game changer these days is uranium. Even tech giants like Microsoft, Nvidia, Meta are making their moves. That's where today's sponsor F3 Uranium comes in. See the ticker on screen. In recent years, F3 Uranium has made one of Canada's biggest high-grade uranium discoveries. Based in the Athabasca Basin, which is one of the world's richest uranium deposits, their flagship JR Zone is already being compared to major sites like NextGen's Arrow and Fission's RRR. With uranium demand set to rise by over 127% by 2030 and 200% by 2040, F3 Uranium is well positioned to ride that wave. Backed by a team with a billion-dollar track record, strong insider ownership, and fresh funding from Denison Mines, F3 Uranium is moving fast and staying focused. And so, as the world turns to nuclear energy to power AI, data centers, and energy security, F3 Uranium is in a prime position to be part of the solution. Check out their ticker on the screen and learn more by clicking the link in the description. Just make sure to do your own due diligence. China builds faster than the world reacts. Since 2020, it has launched over 300 new infrastructure projects across Tibet. The G219 highway has been widened and reinforced. What once took weeks to traverse can now move armored columns from Xinjiang to Tibet in days. Similar upgrades are underway on the G315 and G318 highways, all of which enable faster military movement toward Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. These aren't just roads anymore, they're military corridors. Airports too are expanding. At Shigatse-Heping, new garrisons and drone facilities have been built. The airport now features helicopter landing pads, surface-to-air missile systems, longer runways, and fighter jets such as the J-11. With these upgrades, Shigatse Heping has effectively transformed from a civilian airport into a military hub capable of sustaining high-altitude air operations along the western Himalayan front. Similar expansion projects are underway at Shannon Longsi Airport and Nari Gunsa Airport. The latter sits just 200 kilometers from Pangong Lake, where Chinese and Indian forces have in recent years clashed in melee combat. Meanwhile, up north, China has expanded the Shache Yarkand, Yutian Wanfang, and Ngariburang airports. Each is now capable of serving both civilian and military operations. These upgrades add to a growing network that includes existing military air bases in Lhasa Gongar, Damshung, Ningchi Mainling, Changdu Bangda, Hotan Kungang, and Tashkurgan Kunjarab. In total, at least 24 airports along the Himalayas have been converted into dual-use facilities, with many located within 60 kilometers of the China-India border. That's some serious air power. But Beijing isn't done yet. It now aims to connect many of these airports and bases through railways, such as the Sichuan-Tibet line. Once complete, the line will link Chengdu to Lhasa in under 13 hours, enabling the rapid movement of troops, ammunition, and equipment across 1,600 kilometers of rugged terrain. More importantly, it will branch into smaller tracks that reach even closer to the Indian border. Yes, China has been quite busy, but power projection isn't just about missiles and jets. Sometimes it looks like dams and turbines. That's why many of China's infrastructure projects in Tibet tie directly into hydropower. You see, China holds the world's largest hydropower potential, nearly 3 times that of the United States. Since the 1950s, it has built over 20,000 dams taller than 15 meters, making hydropower the country's second largest source of electricity. Tibet alone accounts for nearly a third of that output. However, perhaps more crucially, hydropower gives China control over the headwaters of major rivers like the Brahmaputra, Mekong, and Salween. These are lifelines for the downstream nations. And so, with that leverage in mind, China is now building the largest dam on Earth in a remote stretch of the Himalayas on the Yarlung Tsangpo River. The project, known as the Medog Mega Dam, is estimated to cost around $137 billion, and it may well be the largest engineering project in history. Once completed, it's expected to generate 60 gigawatts of electricity, which is triple the output of the Three Gorges Dam and enough to power some 300 million homes. Meanwhile, on the western end of the Himalayas, China is quietly working on a second mega dam along the Mabya Zangbo River. Technical details, like its height, length, or capacity, haven't been made public, but everything about the project suggests it will be massive in scale. However, just like with the dual-use infrastructure, the strategy here runs deeper than just generating electricity. Downstream countries, like India and Bangladesh, fear that once these dams become operational, China could weaponize water flow. For example, during an unrelated crisis or a negotiation, it could either release too much water and flood certain areas, or hold water back and trigger droughts. That sounds wild, but the concern is valid. The Medog Megadam, for instance, feeds directly into the Brahmaputra, a river that sustains India's Arunachal and Assam regions and much of Bangladesh. Arunachal Pradesh is a particularly sensitive flashpoint. China considers it part of South Tibet and thus legally claims it as its own. India, however, controls it. So, by pushing ahead with megadams on Tibet's rivers, Beijing isn't just generating power, it's moving closer to hydro-hegemony in South Asia. And this isn't without precedent. In the 1990s, China built a series of dams on the Mekong River in Yunnan province. Over time, these dams reduced the river's flow by nearly 50%. disrupting agriculture, fisheries, and local economies in Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar. History may be about to repeat itself. So, why is this all happening now? Well, energy demand is at an all-time high. The AI boom has kicked off a global tech race, one fueled by data and powered by processors. Training AI models requires massive computing power, and that means massive data centers. These centers consume staggering amounts of electricity. For perspective, a single hyperscale data center can consume between 100 and 200 megawatts, which is enough to power a small city. Multiply that by hundreds, and it becomes clear. Winning the AI race will require nothing less than a complete overhaul of the power grid. Goldman Sachs estimates that power demand from data centers could rise by 50% by 2027 and by 165% by 2030. China is looking to stay ahead of the curve, and this chart shows what that looks like. While electricity generation in the United States has remained nearly flat since 1999, China has more than quadrupled its output and is now aiming to maintain that momentum. That's where Tibet comes in. It plays a crucial role in China's energy plans. Its rivers flow steadily throughout the year, and their high elevation gives them natural hydropower strength. That makes the Himalayas not just a border zone, but a future energy hub. So, when China builds rail tracks into Tibet or dams on rivers near contested borders, it's not just about encircling India. It's about powering an AI economy, securing water control, and reinforcing sovereignty all in one stroke. For all its scale and scope, China's Himalayan buildup may not be what it seems. While the optics suggest belligerence, the rationale may be rooted in something else: deterrence. Beijing's strategic focus is fixed on the eastern seaboard, not the Indian frontier. Taiwan is central to Chinese planning, but any conflict there would almost certainly draw in foreign powers. To offset this risk, China has worked to stretch American resources across flashpoints like Iran, Ukraine, and beyond. But even as its attention stays fixed on Taiwan and America, Beijing can't afford to overlook India. The two already share a long, contested border, and New Delhi's regional clout continues to grow. If China were to open a front in Taiwan, PLA deployments along the western line of actual control would thin out, which would give India a tactical window to press its claims in Aksai Chin. For context, Aksai Chin is the second major disputed region between China and India. It's controlled by the former but claimed by the latter. Even without moving on Aksai Chin, India could rattle China's position by turning up the heat on Pakistan, Beijing's key regional ally. With Chinese forces tied down in the east, Pakistan could find itself without vital logistical and military support. Sensing opportunity, India might choose to press its advantage. One possible target is Pakistan's Gilgit-Baltistan region, a mountainous but critical stretch of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Even an incremental advance there could have an outsized impact. Indian occupation of Gilgit-Baltistan wouldn't topple Pakistan, but it would amputate the main artery linking it to China, and in doing so, shift the regional balance of power. By the way, just to be clear, this video is not a policy recommendation, it's an observation. There is no good or bad in geopolitics, it just is. A distracted China would, in effect, give India a free hand to target either Aksai Chin or Kashmir. And in geopolitics, opportunities like that don't come around often. And so, viewed through a realpolitik lens, China's militarization of the Himalayas isn't just posturing, it's a way to preempt an Indian preemptive strike. The Himalayas, then, are a second front, not for launching an offensive, but for preventing one. The goal is to deny India the belief that it can act opportunistically. By strengthening logistics, fortifying airbase, rapid response units, China is sending a clear message. Even if war breaks out in the East, it can still hold the West. The logic follows basic military thinking. Good infrastructure buys time. With reliable roads, railways, and airports, Beijing will be able to respond more swiftly. And even though a two-front war may be unlikely, the perception of readiness could be enough to deter one entirely. That said, however, perception cuts both ways. India sees China's dual-use infrastructure not as defensive insurance, but as creeping encroachment. In the absence of trust, even a bunker can look like a forward base. And so, what may be a strategy of containment from Beijing's point of view is seen as provocation from New Delhi's. This then is the paradox of the Himalayas today. What's meant to stabilize can just as easily escalate. That said, India is not defenseless. It operates more than a dozen air bases across its northern hinterlands. But when it comes to air power, the gap is hard to ignore. China not only has a quantitative edge, especially in combat jets, but it also holds a clear quality advantage. It's mass-producing 5th-generation fighters and developing 6th-generation models, while India is still struggling to produce reliable 4th-generation aircraft, with no flyable 5th-gen prototype. The technological gap is vast. Add to that China's larger defense budget and greater number of active personnel, and the imbalance becomes even more apparent. Zooming out, the full picture starts to take shape. China is on a construction spree stretching across the arc of the Himalayas. It is building highways, upgrading air bases, and expanding its footprint all over the place. Of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these projects, civilian or military. China has every right to build whatever it sees fit within its own borders. Still, in trying to deter a future war, China may be inadvertently daring India to start one. I've been your host Shivan from Caspian Report. If you approve of what we do,
Australia is a huge country, but while most of the country has at least one major city, such as Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and even Hobart, its northern coastline does not. This is a little odd because this region is so close to the primary shipping lanes connecting to Asia. So why doesn't Australia have a major city along its northern coastline? And before anyone says Darwin is a major city, it's smaller than you probably think. Australia is a continent defined by its contradictions. It's huge, but largely empty. It's surrounded by oceans, yet much of its interior is bone dry. It has some of the most livable cities in the world, yet entire regions remain nearly uninhabited. Understanding the country's physical geography helps explain why Australians have chosen to live where they do, and why so few of them live along the country's northern coast. Australia is the flattest continent on Earth, lacking in towering mountain ranges or active volcanoes. Much of the interior is part of what's known as the Australian Shield, a stable and heavily eroded block of land that hasn't seen mountain building activity in hundreds of millions of years. This has left a landscape of broad plains, shallow basins, and weathered hills. And in the center lies the outback, a sweeping region of deserts and semi-arid scrubland that dominates the image most outsiders have of Australia. But surrounding this harsh core is a more varied periphery, where rainfall is more reliable and the soil somewhat more accommodating. The Great Dividing Range, which runs parallel to the east coast from Queensland down to Victoria, captures moisture from prevailing ocean winds, creating a relatively green corridor in an otherwise dry land. Major rivers like the Murray and Darling flow through this region, albeit erratically. In contrast, the northern region of Australia presents a very different face than either the outback or the fertile southern areas. It lies entirely within the tropics and is dominated by a tropical savanna climate in the west and center and a tropical monsoon climate in the northeast. Unlike the predictable seasons of the south, the north swings between extremes. Months of searing heat and heavy rainfall during the wet season, followed by long stretches of dryness during the rest of the year. And when it rains, it pours. The monsoon can flood rivers and turn dusty plains into wetlands overnight. But during the dry season, those same wetlands vanish, and water becomes scarce again. The terrain of the north is equally challenging. Much of the land is flat and covered in coarse grasses and scattered trees. But the soil quality is poor, heavily leached by centuries of tropical rain. Mangrove-lined estuaries, floodplains, and escarpments add further complexity to the land. Cyclones are another hazard, regularly battering the coastlines of the Northern Territory and Northern Queensland, with destructive winds and heavy rains. Now, all this said, Northern Australia is far from lifeless. The region is home to incredible biodiversity, including some of the last large, relatively untouched tropical ecosystems in the world. This, of course, also comes with some of the most dangerous wildlife and plants that humans have ever encountered. One such plant, commonly known as the stinging tree, is so painful that victims are often in pain for months. It's considered to be the most venomous plant in the world by some metrics. Australia's physical geography is extreme, to say the least. There's a reason why it's well known for its danger. But then, so are Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So why did early British settlements focus so far away from the major colonies and trade networks of Asia? Of course, it all starts with the Aboriginals of Australia. Once again, I've ditched a sponsor for this video because I want to tell you guys all about my awesome Substack. Every week, I write additional articles that go along with my weekly videos, and it's 100% free forever and always. So go to geographicjeff.substack.com to sign up and join this rapidly growing geography community. Long before the British ever set foot on the continent, Aboriginal Australians had spent tens of thousands of years adapting to its diverse and often unforgiving landscapes. But rather than building cities, they lived in cities that moved with the seasons and the availability of food and water. These patterns varied across the country, of course, and largely reflected the land itself. In the fertile southeast and along some river systems, Aboriginals could settle in place for longer periods. In the arid interior, survival required constant movement and deep environmental knowledge. Along the tropical north, communities timed their lives to the rhythms of the wet and dry seasons, adjusting their diets and their locations accordingly. Crucially, Aboriginal settlement was not organized around permanent structures, which would come to define British colonization. Instead, it was deeply rooted in a relationship with the land, shaped by dreamtime stories, seasonal migration, and stewardship practices. The landscape wasn't something to be conquered, but rather something to be understood. This kind of land use left very little physical evidence that European explorers would recognize as civilization, even though these societies were very complex in their own ways. When the British arrived in force in 1788, they brought with them a fundamentally different understanding of land, settlement, and development. They were looking for harbors, farmland, fresh water, and a temperate climate, ideally all in one place. The site of Sydney on the southeast coast. coast checked many of those boxes. It offered a sheltered harbor, manageable weather, nearby forests for timber, and space to grow food. Melbourne, further south, had fertile land along the Yarra River and a cooler climate that was more familiar to British settlers. Perth, founded on the southwest coast, and Adelaide, further along the south-central shoreline, also fit into this mold. These cities became magnets for people looking to start a new life in a new part of the world, some of whom were forced. In fact, the first settlement fleet carried 788 convicts, leading to one of the most well-known, if slightly overstated, historic facts about Australia, that it began its life as a penal colony. The early Australian colonies were largely based on logistical decisions. Settlements were placed where supply ships could safely land, where agricultural output could be maximized, and where European vision of development could be imposed with relative ease. Australia, at the time, was Britain's most remote colony, which meant that it had to be self-sustaining in ways that not even the early North American colonies had to be. Of course, the early British colonizers were keen to settle the North as well, but those attempts rarely went smoothly. Early efforts in places like Port Essington and Raffles Bay, both on the northern coast, failed due to isolation, disease, and harsh conditions. Eventually, Darwin would take root, but it remained a small outpost, more connected to its military role and proximity to Asia than to its economic clout or population size. Queensland, stretching up the northeast coast, did see more successful settlement, particularly in Brisbane and Townsville. But even these cities are located in the far southeast corner of the state, or nestled along more protected segments of coastline. The far north remained largely empty. All told, British settlement in Australia followed the path of least resistance, reinforcing the natural gradients laid down by the physical geography. The cities we know today didn't emerge randomly. They were products of environmental compatibility and colonial convenience. Settlers were not about to brave heat, malaria, flooding, and isolation when more temperate, navigable, and productive land was available elsewhere. Which brings us to today. All of these past issues have since been solved. So why does Australia still not have any major cities in the north? Australia is a large country, but it's not a very populated one. In fact, as of 2025, the country is only home to about 28 million people. This would make it the 54th largest country in the world by population, but because of its massive size, also a country with a very low population density, at only 3.5 people per square kilometer. Even Canada has 4.5 people per square kilometer. So, suffice it to say, Australia's population is more condensed than most other countries, and this leaves vast areas of it with very few people. But one place you might expect at least one large city would be along the northern coastline. Let's look at a map. The northern part of Australia is closer to Southeast Asia than Sydney or Melbourne. It's plain as day. Darwin is physically closer to Jakarta and Singapore than to Canberra, the capital of Australia. And in an era where global trade is dominated by ships moving through the Java and South China Sea, and the ports of Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, Northern Australia appears to sit in a prime location for both imports and exports, almost like a southern gateway to Asia. And yet, the north remains largely empty, dotted with small towns and isolated outposts. Why? Well, to start, it's not like the idea hasn't occurred to Australians. In fact, politicians, military planners, and economic developers have periodically floated proposals to open up the north, or create a new northern capital. But despite these ambitions, no city has ever emerged on a scale even remotely comparable to Australia's southern cities. The reasons are many, and they begin, as they often do in Australia, with geography. The tropical north is one of the most climatically challenging regions of the country. The wet season brings monsoonal rains, intense humidity, and cyclones. Roads frequently wash out. Rivers flood, infrastructure decays more quickly in the heat and damp. Then the dry season arrives, stretching for months, bringing dust, fire risk, and water shortages. This climate rhythm, while manageable for small populations or for industries like mining, makes sustained urban growth difficult. Cities require reliable infrastructure, predictable logistics, and steady access to water and energy. The North provides none of these easily. Even in 2025, the North's remoteness is a problem. It's not just distance from other Australian cities, it's distance from the infrastructure backbone of the country. There are few major highways, limited rail connections, and a thin web of utilities. Building and maintaining a city-scale system in such an environment requires enormous investment. And for what in return? The population base simply isn't there to justify it. Without people, there's no market. Without a market, there's no business case. And without a business case, there's no political will. Then there's the environment itself. Much of the land along the north coast is ecologically sensitive, home to wetlands, mangroves, and unique species. It's also home to some of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Aboriginal Australians have long lived in the north, particularly in the Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, regions that remain deeply significant in cultural and spiritual terms. Large-scale urban development would disrupt these landscapes and risk further marginalizing communities that already face a host of challenges. There's also the legal dimension. Much of the land in Northern Australia is held under forms of Aboriginal title or is subject to land rights claims. Any expansion plan would be complex, controversial, and contested. So if the north is hard to build on, distant from population centers, and environmentally delicate, what about the strategic upside? Being closer to Asia does have value. Darwin, in particular, has taken on an increasingly important role as a military hub, hosting Australian forces and rotations of US Marines. Its port, controversially leased to a Chinese company in 2015 for 99 years, has become a symbol of geopolitical tensions in the Indo-Pacific. This grappling of US military and Chinese economic interests highlights the strategic importance of Australia's northern region. But strategic importance doesn't automatically lead to population growth. A city can be militarily vital and still remain small. Fairbanks, Alaska, for example, is perhaps one of the most strategically important military locations for the United States. But the city has, and will remain, fairly small. Even economic potential has its limits. Northern Australia is rich in minerals, cattle, and gas, and has supported large-scale resource extraction for decades. But these industries don't necessarily require large cities to function. Mining towns rise and fall with commodity cycles. Workers fly in and fly out, usually on months-long cycles. Investment comes in bursts, not in steady flows. That kind of boom and bust economy doesn't build sustainable urban environments like those seen in Melbourne or Sydney. Basically, it builds camps, not cities. In the end, the logic of the South continues to dominate Australia, where about 98% of Australia's population lives. The southeast corner, in particular, with its temperate climate, deep water ports, major rivers, and large existing populations, remains the natural heart of the country. The original decisions made by early colonists to settle Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth weren't just historic accidents. They were decisions reinforced by geography, climate, and connectivity. And in the north, for all its potential, it continues to remain on the periphery, with just 2% of Australia's entire population and no major cities. Darwin, the largest city along the northern coastline, is home to just 140,000 people, and the north as a whole, a little less than 600,000. In the end, geography dictated the first settlements of Australia. History cemented them in place. And now, even in an age of globalization and shifting trade routes, the inertia of those early choices keeps Australia's cities anchored far from its northern shores. I know some of you will probably lean into the whole tropics thing for why there's no city there. But tropical cities tend to fare quite well actually, in terms of population growth. Even Britain founded plenty of successful tropical cities, such as modern Singapore. Australia, in this regard, is just different. Speaking of Australia, this week and the 2 weeks before it, I've been cruising around the country, from the southwest to the outback, and now Tasmania. If you want to see what Australia's geography is really like, go check out those videos on my travel channel. I hope you enjoyed learning all about Australia's northern coast. If you did, why not check out this video all about why Indonesia is moving its capital and why it's a disaster. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Australia is a huge country by size, with a pretty small population overall. And because Australia is overwhelmingly dominant in the region, it's often forgotten that it also owns the 26th largest island in the world, Tasmania, an island that is almost
Imagine a place larger than Germany, but with fewer people than San Jose, California. Sounds wild, right? Welcome to Montana, a state of jaw-dropping beauty, but shockingly empty landscapes. So why does almost nobody live here? Is it the freezing winters, the isolation, or something deeper in its history? Could you survive in a place with more elk than neighbors and a hospital 3 hours away? Let's find out. Number 1, brutal winters that scare people away. Montana's winters are no joke, unless your idea of fun is waking up to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit with snow up to your knees and frozen eyelashes. Yep, temperatures in eastern Montana can plummet as low as minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, especially in towns like Glasgow or Havre. And it's not a one-time freak event, it's an annual expectation. For comparison, that's colder than parts of Siberia and Antarctica during their warmer months. Snowfall? Red Lodge averages nearly 200 inches of snow per year. That's over 16 feet, basically stacking 3 NBA players on top of each other and still needing a shovel. Even major cities like Bozeman and Missoula routinely get 80 to 100 inches annually. And don't even get us started on the blizzards. Whiteout's so intense, you could lose your car in your own driveway. Now, throw in the wind. Montana is home to some of the windiest spots in the US, with gusts hitting 70 miles per hour in places like Livingston. Imagine trying to walk your dog and getting blown into the next town over. Fun? Maybe not. All of this makes everyday life much harder. Heating bills skyrocket. Montanans pay an $2,500 to $3,000 each winter to keep warm. Roads become icy obstacle courses and power outages, not rare. So while Montana may look like a snowy paradise in pictures, living through one of its legendary winters takes grit, snow tires, thermal underwear, and a deep appreciation for frostbite. No wonder so many folks say, beautiful place to visit, but I'm not living there. Number 2. Geographic isolation. Montana is huge. We're talking 147,000 square miles of wide-open nothingness, making it the 4th largest state in the US. But here's the twist. Only about 1.1 million people live here. That's fewer people than you'll find in Dallas, Texas. In fact, Montana's population density is just 7.6 people per square mile. Compare that to New Jersey's 1,200 people per square mile, and you'll see why Montanans have more deer than neighbors. Now, imagine needing to drive hours just to get groceries or visit a decent hospital. Take the town of Glasgow, Montana, for example. It's so remote that National Geographic dubbed it the most isolated town in the contiguous United States. The nearest city, with a population over 75,000, a casual 4.5-hour drive away. That's like living in Los Angeles but driving to Las Vegas just to get to Costco. And don't expect fancy public transport out here. Buses, trains, and subways are a big city luxury. In Montana, your car is your lifeline. If you don't own one, you're stuck. And if it breaks down on a rural highway in winter, good luck, because help could be hours away. Cell service? Spotty at best in the mountains and valleys. Air travel doesn't make things easier. Montana has only 7 commercial airports, and only Billings and Bozeman offer regular flights with multiple connections. Even those can cost you an arm and a leg. A round-trip flight from Bozeman to New York can easily hit $600 or more. So, while Montana's isolation creates serene landscapes and peaceful living, it also means sacrificing convenience, accessibility, and connectivity. For many people, that trade-off is just too much. Living here can feel like choosing to be off-grid didn't mean to be. Number 3, limited economic opportunities. Montana may be rich in natural beauty, but when it comes to economic opportunities, things get a little sparse. The state's economy heavily leans on agriculture, tourism, mining, and timber, industries that are solid, but not exactly booming in today's high-tech job market. In fact, Montana ranks in the bottom third of U.S. states for total GDP, contributing just around $64 billion in 2023. For comparison, that's less than 1% of the national GDP, and smaller than what Starbucks made globally last year. Let's talk jobs. Montana's unemployment rate floats around 3.2%, which doesn't sound terrible, but it hides a deeper issue: underemployment. Many Montanans are working part-time or seasonal gigs just to get by. High-paying industries like tech, finance, and biotech? Not much happening there. Only about 3% of Montana jobs are in the information or finance sectors, compared to over 10% in states like California or New York. The average annual wage in Montana is around $54,000, well below the national average of $65,000. Even in bustling Bozeman, where the economy is considered hot, many workers struggle to find livable incomes. College grads often leave for places like Denver or Seattle, where salaries and opportunities are higher. It's part of the so-called brain drain effect, where young, educated folks hit the road for greener and better-paying pastures. And let's not forget about healthcare access. Montana has one of the lowest physician-to-population ratios in the country, about 198 doctors per 100,000 people. That means long waits, fewer specialists, and, again, hours of driving just to get care. So unless you're a rancher, park ranger, or remote worker with a stable income, making a solid living in Montana can be tough. The land might be wide open, but for many, the opportunities feel painfully limited. Number 4. High cost of living. Here's something that surprises a lot of people. Despite being known for its wide open spaces and rustic charm, living in some parts of Montana can cost you more than living in big cities. Yep, especially in popular places like Bozeman, Missoula, and Whitefish, where housing prices have absolutely skyrocketed in the past decade. Take Bozeman, for instance, a city with just over 56,000 people, but a median home price sitting around $750,000 in 2025. That's higher than Phoenix, Arizona, and creeping dangerously close to Denver prices. Why the hike? Blame it on a wave of out-of-state buyers. Ever since the pandemic normalized remote work, thousands of people from California, Washington, and Texas have flocked to Montana for its scenic lifestyle. This sudden demand overwhelmed local housing markets, and because building codes and infrastructure weren't ready for it, prices shot up fast. In Bozeman, home prices surged by over 100% between 2015 and 2025. Even rent isn't cheap. A basic one-bedroom apartment in Missoula now costs about $1,600 per month, up from $900 a decade ago. Meanwhile, the average salary in Montana is just around $54,000, meaning housing eats up a much larger slice of the paycheck here than in many other rural states. And the sticker shock doesn't stop with rent or mortgages. Grocery prices in Montana are nearly 10% above the national average, thanks to the state's geographic isolation and limited supply chains, gas, utilities, and even internet. Yup, all a bit pricier than you'd expect in a state with more cattle than people. So while Montana may seem like a low-cost rural retreat, that dream can come with a hefty price tag for locals, many of whom earn modest incomes.
Survival myths that would actually get you killed. You and your best bro are sitting on the couch watching TV, bored out of your mind. You're flipping through the channels when you see somebody you recognize. It's the British guy who goes outside and drinks his own pee for fun. After watching him squeeze elephant poop into his mouth to drink water, you decide to go outside and test your survival capabilities, and also test how real common survival knowledge really is in practice. Because let's be real, whether you're an outdoorsy person or not, we've all heard survival tips at some point in our life. Are these tips that we've always just accepted as truth actually life-saving, or could they potentially get you killed? And with you and your friends being inspired, you both pack your bags and head out the door for the adventure of a lifetime, not knowing whether or not this would be your last adventure. You were just dropped in an extremely remote location by a helicopter, and as you watch the helicopter fly off, you and your friend are now completely alone. left to your own devices, and your sole goal is to survive and make it home using only the knowledge that you've heard in passing. Before you and your friend can even take your first steps, you need to first understand what direction should you go. And before you could even think, your friend says, why don't we go north? And while you agree, you have a question. How do we know which way is north? But luckily, everybody knows if you want to know which direction is north, all you have to do is find a tree with moss on it, because moss will only grow on the north side of the tree. So you and your friend begin walking until you notice a tree that has moss growing on the bottom of it. And as you approach the tree, that you can see that the moss is in your direction, meaning that if you just do a 180 and start turning around, you'll be going north. Although, just to be sure, you take a quick look around the tree and realize that there isn't only moss on the north side, there's moss on the north, south, east, and west side. This tree trunk is completely covered in moss, and it's not the only one. All of these tree trunks have moss all over them, meaning that you have no idea which way is north, and also debunking this myth that moss is somehow a compass. But this myth isn't just straight out of a fairy tale. There is some basis of reality here, although it's just not fully accurate or reliable at all. According to Michigan State University, it is more likely for moss to grow more prominently on the north side of trees and rocks, although moss can grow basically anywhere, meaning that if you are using moss to navigate, you are setting yourself up for failure, and in a survival situation, setting yourself up for your own possible demise. And while I like organic stuff as much as the next person, I'm gonna stick to my GPS, or at least my compass, when it comes to navigation. Feeling slightly foolish and a bit betrayed, you and your friend decide to confirm which direction is north with your compass and begin moving. So far, this walk is pleasant, and the forest that you guys are in, and the steps begin to fly by, and you and your friend are almost lost in conversation when your friend realizes something utterly terrifying. Because the vegetation on the ground is so lush, it's almost impossible to see what's lurking around your feet. And while your friend wasn't looking down, a venomous snake was able to slither onto his boot, up his pant leg, and wrap around your friend's thigh. But the snake didn't just end there. This snake, straight out of Diddy University, decided to bite your friend